So welcome to Augustana. I always ask for a 2-minute welcome. Welcome to Augustana. We're a thriving, multicultural, multinational, multi-generational congregation. We're a solar sanctuary congregation, which means there's 145 panels above us. So all our power is from the sun. And we're a sanctuary church, as many know, where that means you are safe here. No weapons allowed. And if you're an immigrant without documentation, you can be here and ICE cannot come in to get you. This is all part of the whole. Violence against the earth, violence against one another. And so this is all about healing and peace and justice. We're a congregation that celebrates who we work with more than ever today. Muslim and Jew, Native American spiritual leaders, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, other people of faith and people of just goodwill. To weave a beloved community Dr. King always talked about. Where everyone is welcomed and affirmed for who God created you to be. And that's all of who you are. That's your age, your ethnicity, where you were born, your gender, your sexual orientation, your non-binary status, your gender expansiveness. Let's keep going. However you were created to be is pure gift to this community of Portland, and is pure gift to the world in which we live. And we know as we leave here, many meetings, we go out to leave the beloved community and together work to renew the creation for generations to come. That is why you are here, and I love seeing hundreds of activists together. We don't charge for anything, because we just want people to gather and do what you're doing. That's the benefit. One little copy. When I was teaching the Job Corps in the 70s, we built a solar greenhouse. And it worked beautifully. And we were pushing wind, solar, geothermal. And when I was doing national work, I was one of 3 spiritual leaders from around the country who was invited to the first ever White House Conference on the Environment. 1994, held in the Presidio. 400 leaders from around the country, 3 of us were faith leaders. And they said, why would a Jesuit be here? A Lutheran, an Episcopalian from different parts of the country. And we tried to explain it until the 3rd day of this week-long conference at the Presidio, before they made it to the People's Park, and a deputy UN ambassador from Mozambique spoke to us. And he said, the environmental crisis is a spiritual crisis. Because we've disconnected ourselves with the creation. We all got moved to the center of the cocktail parties for the rest of the week. And people were coming out saying, well, I grew up Methodist or Jewish, and all my values came from those young years, even though I may not practice anymore. And that's what we're all about. So blessings, a little longer than 3 minutes, but I'm so thrilled to see you. I have to run to the grant group for a while. I'll be back. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
Welcome to Rumble number 11. Get out of that light there. This is our series of Rumble on the River Community Forums. They started a little over a year ago. As you can see, we're on to number 11. And we're very thrilled to have you all here tonight. I don't know, how many of you came here from the Burnside Bridge? For those of you who don't know, the Burnside Bridge was taken over by peace activists tonight. And I understand that the media was out in full force, and this is the first ceasefire demonstration that's actually going to get media coverage in Portland. So we're very happy about that. And it was kind of an interesting coincidence that we're having this forum tonight. Also, it's the end of COP28, so this is an antidote to COP28. So I want to start with acknowledging that the rivers, lakes, streams, and lands of the Lower Willamette River rest upon the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Willamette, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapula, and Malala, as well as other tribes. We recognize the many villages, encampments, traditions, and relationships that existed along the river from time immemorial. We recognize that these tribes cared for the river and the land without harm for thousands of years, preserving it for future generations. We recognize and take responsibility for the destruction of river and land, of traditional food sources, sacred places, and sustainable way of life. We acknowledge the economic and social values that made the harm to the river possible, including systemic racism, classism, and the disregard for Black and immigrant communities along the river. With this acknowledgement, we commit to honoring the difficult lessons of the past and working towards a more equitable and sustainable way of life along the Lower Willamette River. We commit to finding solutions that acknowledge the inequities of the past economic policies and the harm done to the people all over the world due to climate change. We commit to listen and work together for mutually beneficial solutions that provide for future generations. Well, I still didn't have a piece of paper here. Okay. So I'm Barbara Bernstein, and I do Locus Focus on Kibu every Monday morning. And I'm supposed to talk about my connection to the river. And my connection to the river is that I've lived close to the Willamette River most of the time that I lived in Oregon, and I live 10 blocks from it now. But I live on the part of the river that is beautiful in Selwood, where we have a beach, and we have a wetland, Oaks Bottom, and forests along the river. And every time I go to Lytton and I go to North Portland, I see what the river could be. And so for the last number of years, I've been part of a community of people that are trying to transform the North Reach of the river to be more like the South Reach. And that's my connection to the river. One of the most important things we have to talk about tonight is where the restrooms are. If you go out that door and take your first right, there's a men's and women's room right there. And we also have in the back of our programs, everybody get a program? Okay, on the back is a list of all the elected officials that you need to contact to talk to them about all the things that we're talking about in these forums and any other things you have concerns about that are going wrong with the city. So they're the most up-to-date contact information you can get. And then we want to make sure that you stick around after the panel for Q&A, and it should be pretty interesting. The other thing is that we have comment cards that you can send to your elected officials, as well as to the Department of Environmental Quality, which is going to be hearing or deciding on an air quality permit for Zenith Energy. Anybody here doesn't know what Zenith Energy is? Okay. Anyway, so we're trying to keep them honest about that. And the comment cards are in the room to my right, where all the tables are, the organizational tables. So you can go and sign cards that will go to Tina Kotek, to your congressional rep, to the city of Portland, and to DEQ. So now we're going to start with our first panelist. Now, just the format tonight's a little different from usual because most of our panelists are not here. They're going to be there. So our first one, before we get there, actually, I want to thank all of our co-sponsoring organizations, which is a lot of them. And we're going to get a slide. I think we need a slide of our co-sponsors. Here they go. Okay. So here they are. 350 PDX, Alliance for Democracy, Arbor Lodge Neighborhood Association, Greater River Campaign, Breach Collective, Cathedral Park Neighborhood Association, Columbia Riverkeeper, Poli Association of Neighbors, Eco Faith Recovery, Extinction Rebellion PDX, First Unitarian Portland Community for Earth, Hammurabi Climate Action, Human Access Project, Hebrew Radio 90.7 FM, Kenton Neighborhood Association, Linton Neighborhood Association, Mount Tabor Neighborhood Association, Neighbors for Clean Air, Oregon Chapter of the Sierra Club, Oregon Conservancy Foundation, Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, Pearl District Neighborhood Association, BEST Projection, Portland Audubon, Portland Harbor Community Advisory Group, Portland Harbor Community Coalition, Portland Jobs for Justice, Portland Raging Grannies, Portland Youth Strike, Portsmouth Neighborhood Association, Sylvia Island Community Association, St. John's Neighborhood Association, Third Act Portland, Sunrise Movement PDX, and Willamette Riverkeeper. And as you can see, you've got a great range of community organizations that are sponsored. Thanks to everybody. So we're going to start with Barbara Haya, who is with us from Berkeley. I think we're going to get her up in just a moment. Okay, she's a research fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and an expert on carbon offsets. And so we will have Barbara up in just a moment. Okay, we're still working on getting Barbara. There she is. There's Barbara. Hi, Barbara.
The speaker. Everything's set up.
We're good. Yeah, you're ready to go.
Okay, my apologies. Hello, and it's wonderful to be here, even if it's not in person, but on video. I think it's an evening of false climate solutions, and I'm going to talk about the one that I've been studying for the last 20 years, and that's carbon offsets. And I want to start off and apologize. I have, for my scratchy throat, I have the worst cold. So what I'm going to do for the next 15 minutes is take you on my journey of studying 3 generations of carbon offset programs over the last 20 years and my thoughts on the way forward. So I started my PhD research studying the UN or the Kyoto Protocol's offset program, the Clean Development Mechanism. It's the first major carbon offset program, and to date still the largest carbon offset program. And under the Kyoto Protocol, industrialized countries had caps on their emissions, developing countries didn't have caps. And industrialized countries, in arguing, negotiating the Kyoto Protocol, argue that greenhouse gases are well mixed in the atmosphere. It doesn't matter where reductions happen, so if it's cheaper to reduce emissions in developing countries or elsewhere in the world than it is to reduce our own emissions domestically, why shouldn't we be allowed to reduce emissions where it's cheapest? So, there was born the first major carbon offset program. Each, to date, it's generated 2.4 billion credits. Each credit should represent 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent reduced or removed from the atmosphere. And I set out on my PhD research to study the project type with the most credits on the market then, as well as today, which is renewable energy and hydropower, with field research in India. And in my early pre-dissertation research, I was exploring how this program was working, focused on biomass electricity generation. And in my very early interviews with some of the first projects to generate credits, I saw that there was a real problem. Excuse me. And in these early interviews, the sugar factory owners who had implemented these cogeneration plants using sugarcane waste, when I asked them, why they built the project, what was the origin, what they said was, well, the Indian government had these subsidies, there was a really good preferential tariff per kilowatt hour produced, and now we're not only sugar producers, but we're also electricity producers. It just made financial sense. And then I asked them, but when you applied to participate in the Kyoto Protocol's offset program, you had to show that your project would not have been built were it not for the offset income, because the whole idea was, industrialized countries should be able to use these credits from projects for reductions that they make happen. So if they generate credits from projects that were going ahead anyway, those projects are not additional, they were not valid. And the sugar factory owners then told me the arguments that they put in their application to the UN as to why they wouldn't have built the project were not for carbon offsets, even though they had just told me that they would have. And they didn't see that as being a problem. They didn't see themselves as gaming the system. They saw, my sense was that they saw themselves as they were doing projects that had global benefit, they were being paid for those benefits, and then they were just filling out the paperwork that didn't make any sense anyway, which is what I found as well, that the paperwork didn't make sense. And basically, what was, I ended up finishing my dissertation showing that, this problem that I saw in my very early interviews was a systematic problem with the program, that the large majority of these projects most likely were non-additional, should never have been allowed to generate credits. And the main reason was that it was impossible for the UN to review the, all of these applications and know which projects would have gone forward and which projects wouldn't, who was fudging the numbers and who was really, saying accurately what they likely would have done were it not for the offset income. Most projects could prove that they wouldn't have been built without the offset income by doing a financial assessment and showing their projections that without offsets, the project wouldn't be cost effective. And I showed with my dissertation research that it was easy for project developers to strategically make assumptions to show that cost-effective projects were not cost-effective. After this research, another study came out that covered a broader set of project types, and they found that only 2% of projects are likely to be really additional and not overcredited. Major quality issues with this program. I then turned attention to California's offset program, second generation offset program. This program was structured in, I think, a much better way. Instead of requiring every single project developer to prove that they wouldn't have built their project individually, the program uses standardized approach where they identified here 6 different project types that most likely wouldn't have gone ahead. They claimed without offset income, the offset income could make a difference, and any project that meets the eligibility criteria is automatically considered additional and allowed to participate. And the way such a standardized approach can work is if there's conservativeness or undercrediting embedded in the rules for how you estimate emissions reductions to counterbalance the inevitable participation of some non-additional activities. Almost all projects or credits are from forests. All of these projects are limited to the US. For the forest projects, it's mostly improved forest management, and there are a number of real problems with the improved forest management. So that's just to say, I think California's program is structured in a much better way, but the devil is in the details, and the rules have to be written in a way that protects quality. Very quickly, the way improved forest management protocol works is that any landowner in the US who holds and commits to continuing to hold enough carbon on their landscape or on the participating lands that's more than common practice or more than the average for their project, for their forest type, is allowed to participate and generate credits equal to the amount that they're holding above the average for their project type. It's a bit more complicated, but not so much more complicated. Basically, in the first year of the project, the landowner, here's an example of a typical project. The landowner starting off with carbon per acre or total amount of carbon, much larger, much higher than the average or the baseline. The first year they generate this number of credits, and then as the forest grows, each year they generate the amount credits equal to the amount that it grows. So the obvious problem with this is that on average, if the baseline is the average, by definition, half of forest land already holds more than average carbon. There's a lot of diversity on the landscape, and those landowners that are already holding more can get credited for not doing any change, but just continuing what they were doing. And several studies came out showing that, in fact, this is what's happening, that a lot of the participating lands start off, or almost all participating lands start off with much more carbon than the baseline, and it looks like they had been managing the land like that for a very long time, and similar lands also hold more carbon. So there's a serious baselines for additionality issue, but there are 3 other main issues that are also leading to overcrediting. And for one, a lot of the baselines are not accurate, so there's overcrediting, but let's say the baseline is accurate, and they really would have, were it not for the offset income, reduced the carbon on their landscape and harvested and produced timber. And now they're not. But if you don't change the demand for timber products, that timber is going to come from somewhere else. And I showed that the very weak accounting methods is leading to lots of overcrediting, and 50 to 80% of credits generated is likely overcredited because of very weak ways of accounting for this leakage. Also, you have questions about reversal risk, and that is when you hold carbon in natural systems to offset fossil fuel emissions, that the climate benefit is can be largely reversed if there's a fire, if there's a beetle outbreak, if the carbon is not maintained but leaves the forest. And each forest landowner has to keep aside a number of credits equal to the risk, and the amount that's held aside is much lower than what's needed to account for the real risk, especially with climate change. And a PhD student that I worked with found that there's a perverse incentive that in California and the Pacific Northwest, where there's overstocked lands and there's a real need for fuels reduction and thinning to prevent catastrophic fire, that this protocol is working at odds with, for example, California's efforts or subsidies for this thinning, where if you the incentive created by the program is to hold more and more carbon over time, you're paid for that. And that's directly at odds with some of the lands where there's an imperative to thin and reduce the amount of carbon to prevent catastrophic fire. I can come back to this if there's interest. And so the third generation of offset programs is the voluntary carbon market. And this is really driven by companies and universities and cities and others that have taken on carbon neutrality goals or other climate goals and plan to meet those goals largely with offsets because it's cheaper. And how many?
3 minutes.
Okay.
3 minutes.
I'll go quickly through this. And for the voluntary market, I scanned the market, and it's hard to find project types and methodologies that are not overcredited. And I want to quickly just go through, I recently completed an in-depth study of the project type with the most credits on the market, a chunk of these credits, and it's from avoided deforestation. These are projects globally. I brought together a team of researchers to take a look at these methodologies and the quality of these credits, and not only look at the quality of the credits, but also look under the surface and try to understand, well, what's going on when there is poor quality. And basically what we found was that, for one, we found poor quality overcrediting under every rock we turned. And that is, we were just surprised at how everywhere we looked there were problems. So the question is, why is that? Why does that happen? We found that the methodologies are not science aligned, right? The methodologies are not written in a way that avoids overcrediting, but perhaps more importantly, the methodologies are written in a way to accommodate many different lands. So there's a lot of flexibility, to accommodate projects from all around the world. And when there's flexibility and uncertainty, the project developers were making carbon accounting choices that, of course, led to more credits and less. Why wouldn't they? And the third-party auditors or verifiers that were hired to audit each project, they weren't doing their job to ensure conservativeness. And sort of our diagnosis of the problem is that it's three elements or inherent characteristics of the offset market. That is the reason why I'm having the same conversations I'm having today as I had 20 years ago when I was doing my PhD research. And that is uncertainty. These estimating emissions reduction from offsets is inherently uncertain. We know how to measure emissions. It's much harder to measure emissions reductions. You have to measure it against a counterfactual scenario that never happened. That's immeasurable and highly uncertain. That uncertainty is being deliberated by a set of market players where everyone in the market benefits from more credits and poor quality. That is, the buyer wants, cheap credits. The seller, the developer wants to generate more credits for doing less. The verifier is hired by the developer themselves, and then the registries or the standards that are writing the rules, they compete with one another. And if one significantly strengthens and ensures quality, there's a risk that everyone's going to run to the other registries and the other methodologies. There's a race to the bottom. And last slide is really quickly, how do we get out of this mess? And there's a lot of effort happening right now to ensure quality. We're not talking about 20, 30% over-credited. We're talking about 6, 8, 10, 15 times over-credited over 20 years of there's many different programs. And I think it's absolutely clear in this moment of the climate emergency that we're in, we have to move away from the idea of offsets. We need to focus on direct emissions reductions, period. And then if companies or individuals, universities want to do more and donate to other mitigation projects to do more than they can, more than they're going to do directly themselves to reduce their own emissions, make a contribution. Don't call it an offset. And then if you're going to quantify the outcomes of that contribution, use the latest science and be conservative when there's uncertainty. And looking forward to the discussion and happy to answer questions. I don't know if you want to do that now.
Actually, we're going to do that after all the panel is over. So thank you very much, Barbara. Anything else you want to say, or you're done?
No.
Okay, thanks a lot. And our next panelist is here in the room with us, Alex Budd, who's sitting right next to me. And Alex is an organizer with Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance. Do you want to stand up?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, other Barbara. I'm also going to be speaking about forest carbon offsets and kind of building off what Barbara was just talking about. And I kind of want to take a step back a little bit. I think this really in detail, breakdown of what the technical problems are with forest offsets, or offsets in general, is really helpful. And I think there are also some bigger, more fundamental issues that it's important not to lose sight of when we're talking about offsets and forest offsets in particular. Kind of the highline message here, if you remember nothing else, is that forest carbon offsets, not only are they a false solution that don't work, they're a perpetuation and deepening of the same destructive logic of commodification and exploitation that's at ultimately the root of the climate and biodiversity crises. And we're never going to solve that problem with more of that kind of thinking. I can talk a little bit about offsets in the Northwest. There hasn't been as much in the Northwest as there is around the world, especially in the global South, for some of the reasons that Barbara was talking about, but also just because timber companies here have been able to make more money by cutting the trees than by leaving them standing. But we are seeing that beginning to change. There's some offset projects owned by Lewis and Clark Timberlands out in the Northern Coast Range. That company is owned by TIAA-CREF, Some of you may have, they might be doing that with some of your retirement money. You can feel free to write them an angry letter. Green Diamond is another company that has, another timber company in Oregon that owns a lot of forest land. They have sold some offsets, I think, to fossil fuel companies and also big tech companies. A bunch of those actually burned in the Boot Lake fire a couple years ago. A great example of that reversal problem that Barbara was just talking about. I want to step back and not just focus on that, and again, talk about this bigger issue. And I think a helpful way to do that is to tell a story. Has anyone here heard of Who Will Own the Forest? Is that a few people? Okay. Who Will Own the Forest is an annual conference, timber industry conference. It's been going on for, I think, 20 years. It's hosted by the World Forestry Center here in Portland. And it brings together big forest landowners, so Green Diamond, Sierra Pacific Industries, Weyerhaeuser, as well as capital, is I think the best way to name it. So that's literal banks and also Wall Street firms, investors, fund managers, and increasingly we're also seeing, their last conference was just in September. Some of you may have been there. There were some actions and protests. It did not go as planned this year. But we're increasingly also seeing carbon offset companies and big tech companies and AI companies moving into this space and taking up a bigger portion of the room. And I think Who Will Own the Forest, the conference, is really helpful for thinking through these issues because it illuminates kind of some of the political, bigger picture dynamics at play here. Capital is there because they have money and they want more money, and they're looking for ways to make more money. The forest owners are there because they own all this land and they're looking for how can they extract the most value from it. And they're willing to look beyond just cutting the trees for ways to do that increasingly. We're seeing offset companies show up there. A lot of offset companies are actually just fossil fuel companies, it turns out. So one of the companies that was at Who Will Own the Forest is a company called Finite Carbon, which is owned by British Petroleum. Another one that was there is Blue Carbon, and that's owned by, I'm not sure about the specific owner. It's based in the UAE, and it's their money for buying offsets is UAE oil money. And actually, there was just some news that came out last month. I think it was about a month ago, exactly. Just kind of a side note here, one of the main problems with offsets is that they're driving the dispossession of indigenous peoples off their lands around the world. And so Blue Carbon is one in particular. Last month, the Okige people in Kenya were driven out of there, a number of villages, specifically so that the land could be used and sold by Blue Carbon for forest offsets. So, like, aside from like whether or not these are effective tools for addressing climate change, there's much deeper also justice questions as well that it's important not to lose sight of. And then tech companies. Well, so I guess the other thing, the fossil fuel and offset companies, they're showing up in these spaces and getting more and more interested in forest offsets. They're doing that because they're looking for ways to protect their money. Fossil fuel companies are looking for any way possible to not have to stop drilling and burning fossil fuels, and offsets give them an escape hatch for that. And then we're also seeing tech companies show up in this space, and they're bringing promises of, I guess what I would call superficial problem solving, offering fancy tools, AI systems, drones for forest landowners and offset companies to more accurately account for exactly how much carbon they have in their 2 million acres or however much they own, so that they can maximize their profit from selling offsets and maximize their profit from timber harvests. So Who Will Own the Forest, I think this intersection makes clear that markets and these organizations grow money, not forests, not carbon, and that's ultimately their motivation, not the well-being of forests or humans or the climate. And so beyond these grandiose claims of, forest companies and offset companies are going to save us all and save the climate, it's important to remember these are profit-driven companies and their ultimate goal is to make more money. And they're using nature-based solutions like forest offsets as a fig leaf to cover up business as usual and allow them to continue perpetuating it and extend their social license to continue operating. The Who Will Own the Forest Conference used to be much more of a traditional timber corporation, landowner, and investor bank capital conference, but we are increasingly seeing a shift now with these offset companies coming in. And that was, this year seemed, from what we heard from people who were on the inside, talking with people who have been to the conference for many years was that in the past, it's a fancy conference, they have panels and sessions and speakers. In the past, the offset people were kind of at the very end of the agenda when most people had left, and they were kind of like this weird addendum in a side room. And this year, they're front and center, right in the middle of the conference when there's maximum attendance. That is who timber companies and these capitalists, that's who they most want to hear from. That's what they're interested in. And I think a lot of that is because we're seeing so much money flow into quote-unquote climate action now. And these timber companies are seeing there's a lot of money to be made here by selling offsets. Maybe more money than by cutting the trees. But on that note, these timber companies are, again, they're interested in making money, and they're interested in using their land and their forests to make as much money as possible. They'll sell offsets if that makes them more money than cutting the trees. But if cutting the trees ends up making them more money than offsets, like they'll cut those offset forests down. That's a problem that we've actually seen with the offset market in California as well. And some of the research that Barbara was alluding to, an investigative work that's come out, I think just in this last year. If offsets aren't profitable, they're not going to hesitate to log the trees. And it's really important that our forest management practices at large change. Logging is a major source of emission. In Oregon, it's actually the single largest source of climate emissions, larger than transportation, larger than in residential and utility heating. It's not larger than transportation and utility electric generation combined, but it is the largest single source. And so in that sense, logging a forest is kind of a climate double whammy. Not only is the accumulated carbon that's been stored in a forest lost and emitted when we cut the trees down, but we also lose that future sequestration capacity. And we know that the older mature forests not only store but also accumulate the most carbon. And so in that sense, if a patch of forest land is sold as an offset for 50 years, but then it's logged, that negates all that offset, all those emissions that were offset, so then they are released and it's like it never happened. Especially if it means that whatever company was buying those offsets didn't invest all that money for 50 years in actual emissions reductions. So it pulls money away from potentially real solutions and puts it in these false solutions instead. All these schemes rest on the premise that there will continue to be capital for offsets in order to pay for them. And that money spigot will theoretically continue to flow for decades. Where does that money come from? This brings us back to the offset companies and the fossil fuel industry, because that's ultimately where this money is coming from, or where the bulk of it will come from. I mentioned blue carbon and finite carbon. There's a number of others. There's been kind of a rush over the last couple of years with a lot of smaller startup offset companies being bought out by fossil fuel companies. They don't advertise that they're owned by fossil fuel companies. They have an interest, obviously, in making it seem like they're very separate. But that's definitely been a trend with the industry. And so in that sense, forest and all offsets are dependent on the continued profitability of the fossil fuel industry. If the fossil fuel industry stopped generating so much wealth, there wouldn't be money to pay for these offsets. And especially with forest offsets, that means those forest owners, those timber companies, when the offset money dries up, they're going to go in and log the trees anyways. Let's see. So kind of big picture, we're seeing an expansion from these timber companies and others viewing forests as board feet of merchantable timber and not much else, to they're now willing to see them also as accountable, measurable, and sellable carbon. But it's that same underlying logic of measuring, accounting, and commodifying complex ecosystems and worlds into dead matter for mostly rich humans to exploit and benefit and buy and sell. I do want to touch on, where am I at on time?
We got 4 minutes left.
Woo, okay. That always goes so fast. I guess I'll just mention the AI and tech companies moving in, I think are notable in this regard, and then again, they're promising to help these companies and these industries do a more accurate, fine-grained job of that measuring, accounting, commodifying, for the purpose of exploiting and selling. And as also it's kind of a double offer there. Not only can our drones and AI systems help you better measure exactly how many board feet you have, so you know what the best price is when you're contracting loggers, but they can also help measure the exact amount of carbon so you get the most money you possibly can when you're selling offsets. And big tech companies as well are increasingly big buyers of carbon offsets. And I think a lot of that, in addition to the fossil fuel industry, and I think a lot of that is because tech company supply chains are really hard to decarbonize, especially as the industry has moved to a model where they don't own all the pieces, all the steps of their supply chain. A lot of that is contracted out. So they don't have as much direct control to do decarbonization or emission reductions. But they do have lots of money to buy offsets for, to brand themselves as green and sustainable. So bottom line, the problem here is that fossil fuel companies are going to keep digging and burning fossil fuels, keep getting richer, and pouring more and more money into offsets to make it look like they aren't wrecking the planet. And in that sense, offsets are an escape hatch primarily for the fossil fuel industry to avoid more fundamental emissions reductions, and ultimately to avoid the industry from having to change their practices and cease to exist. So all these accounting tricks can make it look on paper like the carbon balance is out, like we're at net zero, we're on our way to net zero, but the world ultimately is not an accounting ledger. We aren't lords and rulers and programmers of the entire world or all the ecosystems that we live within. And it's an analogy I find helpful is to think of it, it's like treating the world like a fish tank. There are these very complex ecosystems and forests that have a lot of accumulated wisdom over millennia for how to regulate carbon flows and keep our planet livable. But now with these technologies, with things like offsets and this accounting, measuring, commodifying approach, as well as other false climate solutions like direct air capture, carbon capture and storage, it's like we're stepping in and treating the world like we can do the same thing. There's these ecosystems that regulate the carbon system and keep our planet livable, but we don't need them anymore because we've got these technologies that allow us to do the same thing. So we can extract and exploit those ecosystems out of existence. And in that sense, like other offset schemes, other false solution schemes, offsets are ultimately a work of hubris. And they embody this idea that we can design and regulate the carbon cycle and the entire biosphere. And I guess to kind of bring it to a close, I think to me this highlights the question of how do we understand the problem of climate change? Do we understand it as a technical problem? We just have this unlucky fluke of atmospheric chemistry where it just so happens that some of the byproducts from our industrial processes happen to heat the atmosphere, and that's a problem. So we need technical solutions. We just need to tweak some things around the edges, but we can continue business as usual. Or is this a political problem? It's a problem of who has power in our society, how that's distributed, who gets to make decisions. But even beneath that, I think some of the folks that have been calling out false solutions and offsets for decades are indigenous communities and organizers who point to even beneath the political problem layer, this is a relational problem, a problem of how we relate to each other and the world around us. And that without addressing that, all this other stuff is kind of window dressing on the surface to allow the system that we have to continue and to allow these people to keep profiting. So I didn't make it through quite everything, but I'm going to close it there and hand it back to Barbara. Thank you.
We're going to go back to the screen now, and our next panelist is Peter Riggs. He's the director of Pivot Point, a Washington nonprofit. We're still with Barbara, but we'll get to Peter in just a moment. Here.
Hoping you can hear me okay. I'm going to talk.
Oh, there you are.
How about that? I'm going to talk for a moment and show a couple of slides. I'm sorry not to join with you in your space. It looks like a beautiful space. And I hope that you're all among friends and appreciate you working this hard material. Really appreciate Barbara and Alex for talking about the carbon market piece. And we're talking tonight about false solutions. A number of us were involved with COP28 with that agenda. And happy to report that actually things went well at one level in terms of the attempt to establish global rules on carbon markets. It was turned away again, second year in a row. And we do see some elements of the system crumbling, some weaknesses, and Barbara's empirical research certainly helped in that. So I want to express my gratitude for that work. And I'm going to change the subject. Everybody takes a deep breath. A different, unfortunate kind of false solution, which is coming to the Pacific Northwest in a very concrete way, very specific way. So I want to talk basically about why this industry has developed, what it means locally, and what we can do about it. And the industry specifically is on the front end of the biomass power supply chain, which comes out of forest biomass, which is pulverized, dried, turned into pellets, compressed, and the plan is to ship it overseas on the Columbia River first, and then over to South Korea and Japan. That's the proposal. That's the potential impact locally. Let me tell you how we got there. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. So this actually also starts with a weird counting error. When in the early 90s, they started to make rules about how to count greenhouse gas emissions. This was with the IPCC. This was an important part of the IPCC's early work. They were working in a whole of globe context. They were really thinking about the conservation of mass, and basically they were designing for climate models. They were designing for integrated assessment models. What they were not designing was a way to properly describe life cycle emissions for products or supply chains. But that's kind of how it's been used, and particularly it's been seized on by industry with respect to forest products and with respect to forest-based energy, which, as Alex referred to, combines two lobbying powers, both energy centralized utilities and the forest lobby, which is particularly strong, of course, in the Pacific Northwest. So industry put forward this idea of carbon neutrality. Because trees grow back, it shouldn't be a problem to harvest them, pulverize them, burn them, and expect the regrowth to cancel out the carbon that was released into the atmosphere at the point of combustion. But the IPCC rules said, again, as a result of wanting to operate at the global scale, no, you count the emissions when there's a change in forest. And that means when you cut that forest down. Practically what that means for biomass power is the emissions at the smokestack, which are considerable, which are worse than coal emissions in most cases, those don't need to be counted. You get off for free because the blame, the accounting has been done at the forest level, and that forest was harvested, and therefore doesn't show up at all in the energy accounts. Now think about what that means in terms of co-firing with coal. Co-firing is when you take a percentage of wood pellets, 10-15% is very common, and co-fire together in the same boilers with coal. You've magically decreased your emissions through co-firing. So it's kind of a crazy situation. Some of you may recall the fight or the discussion 2018 and 2020 around Boardman, the potential of the conversion of the Boardman plant, last coal-fired plant in Oregon. They briefly toyed with the idea of converting to biomass. There was a lot of outcry, but I think more importantly, they did a supply chain analysis. They did a source area analysis. How much material could they draw from profitably in Boardman? They found out it just didn't work. But now we have a different problem further west. So the original sin of this industrial scale biomass power sector, this damaging industry, comes from two things. One is you don't have to count emissions. The second, equally nasty, is you can say it's renewable energy. It qualifies as green energy, and therefore in many places has qualified for green energy subsidies. That's particularly true in the UK and Europe, and increasingly in East Asia. One of the first companies to exploit these carbon rules, to understand that they could claim emission reductions by switching to wood pellets instead of coal, was a UK utility called Drax. And now Drax is here, and now Drax has come for our trees. Now I want to show you some slides, so hold on just 1 second. Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah.
I don't know if you can see it. See that? Okay. So bring trees and coal plants. Who thought that was a good idea? Modern biomass. This is what you're looking at. This is what you're talking about, the kind of industrial facility that the UK utility Drax wants to site in Longview, Washington. This is an example from a Drax plant in Mississippi, about the same size as is proposed for Longview. There's lots of euphemisms: modern biomass, renewable biomass, sustainably sourced, sustainable biomass programs. Same kind of attempt to use certification and verification process to say no, it's all okay. So the first step in this value chain is a pellet plant. You have to dewater, which means dry the material, pulverize it in hammer mills, which are extremely loud, and then pelletize it. So you get loud and dirty when you get one of these, quote, modern biomass plants. Drax has two other problems in terms of its own corporate culture. In the US South, this plant in Mississippi is directly adjacent to a majority African American poor community. They've consistently sited their plants in disadvantaged areas in the US South. I'd say there's a similar dynamic at work in Longview. There's also a plant proposed in Hoquiam in Grays Harbor County, Washington. Same kind of situation. Massive overcutting leading to a loss of timber jobs, drying up of opportunities, and a real premium on job creation in those counties. Drax is also notorious for another reason. In two states which, barely have air regulation frameworks, Louisiana and Mississippi, they've paid more than $3 million in fines just in the last 30 months for what they've done in terms of local air pollution, primarily through underestimating emissions in order to secure permits. Better to pay the fine later than to be denied the permit on the front end and you don't get to operate at all. So find yourself, I don't know exactly where you are in this beautiful space, but I'm glad you're there, and somewhere you're in this radius. This is Drax's sourcing area, a 50-mile radius around Longview. Includes an incredible mix of public and private lands. You'll know more about what's on the Oregon side of the border than I do. I know mostly about Cowlitz County and that area. And here's what Drax says it's going to burn. Limbs, tops, sawdust, blah, blah, unmerchantable timber, okay? So I have a question for you. What does a woodpecker call unmerchantable timber? Home, right? That's what it calls it. Kinds of high biodiversity opportunities through snags and crooked trees and everything that are very important to that nature. Drax says it's going to burn this material and at the same time does not expect to increase overall demand within this radius for primarily what's called aftermarket materials. But already in the Port of Longview are more than a half dozen pulp and paper and other kinds of industrial concerns. And Drax coming in and bringing air pollution with it could conceivably push this whole area into, quote, non-attainment of federal air quality standards, a real degradation. We should also ask the people who are near Washington how they feel about having 100 decibel continuous noise across the river from the hammer mills used to pulverize old trees, beautiful trees in the Pacific Northwest, pulverize them, dry them, pelletize them, put them on ships, send them to East Asia. I don't think it's a great idea. So Drax is proposing a scale which will involve 200 trips a day by lorries or major trucks. Think about what you know about where the choke points are across the Columbia and wonder what that will mean for those roads heading across the bridges there. We tried a couple ways to quantify what Drax is looking for. Remember that they have to dry material, and instead of doing, they lose a lot of weight. They're proposing a pellet mill of 500,000 tons a year, which would mean 1 million tons of green wood harvested per year to run this mill if it were permitted and brought to the size that they're seeking. So one thing we did is we looked at the timber sales in the Cowlitz Ranger District, which has mostly, it's only a little bit within Cowlitz County, actually. It's to the east of there, and it's national forest. And there's thinning activities, there's some harvest activities. We summed them together. We saw what that would look like if converted to dry pellets, and then compared it to Drax's projected annual wood demands. Another way to look at it, okay, let's go with the dedicated harvest, not just thinning from a big area, but let's think about growing purpose-grown biomass, fast-growing poplar, that after you establish it, you can harvest something every 3 years. If you were to superimpose that on the area of Cowlitz County, how much would that be in total demand? A dedicated demand of the county's area would go into fueling Drax, and we found that it was 40%. Would go into the pellets, 40% of the land on an ongoing basis. And then to dry it, you need some source, and the cheapest source is hog fuel. Hog fuel, you may be familiar with it if you've driven by landscapes that look bulldozed, because essentially all wood fiber and everything that could possibly be pulled out, even if there's rocks and other kinds of material in it, it will be brought and used, in a low efficiency stove to dry these pellets, and adding a lot to the air quality burden. So once again, this is one of 2 plants proposed for Washington. They have overlapping sourcing areas, and the final kicker is it's not even energy for Oregon or Washington. Pellets are going to East Asia, where biomass would be burned in existing coal plants, prolonging the life of that fossil fuel infrastructure. So in conclusion, it's not an industry we want. It's not a new rationale for logging. It's not a company we want, given the reputation and actions in the American South. And biomass is just not part of the energy transition we want or need. If we start hearing biomass thrown around in the context of hydrogen hubs, let's be careful about that. I think we welcome the opportunity to develop a hydrogen hub in the Pacific Northwest as part of the transition, but let's make sure it's done with clean and renewable energy and not with biomass. What can you do? Southwest Clean Air Agency of Washington has guaranteed that they will hold a public hearing. It hasn't been scheduled yet because Drax hasn't finalized the request for an air discharge permit, but that's underway, and it could be as early as the first quarter. It might be in the second quarter next year. 350 PDX is showing a wonderful film, Burned. They may show a half an hour, they may show an hour. There's a couple of different cuts. Outstanding film that looks at this industry, particularly in the US East and also a couple places internationally. What else did I want to say about that? So get in touch with 350 PDX. We'd like to put a lot of pressure on Drax and prevent them from being permitted and basically chase them out of the region. We do not want to see our beautiful forests mashed, pulverized, put on ships, and used to prolong the life of coal plants in Asia. Thanks everybody for the chance to chat.
Thank you, Peter. And our next speaker is also on the screen, Melanie Clout. She is a retired OBGYN and is with Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. There's Melanie.
All right, can you see my slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start with an apology for not being there. I planned to be there in person, but I woke up this morning with a fever, and I thought the wiser thing was not to come and expose you all, though I feel totally fine now, so I'm kind of frustrated. And also a disclaimer. I am, as many of you know, a retired OBGYN doctor. I'm not a chemist. I'm not a climate scientist, and I'm a little bit out over the tips of my skis on this topic, but I will try to give you the basics as I understand them. And I think that Deneen printed some copies of a handout, a nice little two-pager that Earth Justice did about hydrogen that has many of the main points that I'll be making. So Deneen, if you're out there, make that available to people.
It's on the table.
Okay. Now, you're probably going, that's not what I thought this talk was going to be about, and you're right. This is our old friend methane. So why did I start this talk on hydrogen by talking about methane? Well, there's kind of an interesting connection. So this is a graph from the US EIA of annual natural gas production. And you can see it was kind of flat between 1970 and 2005 or so. And then there's a big uptick. And you've probably guessed that uptick was due to fracking. And all of a sudden, we had this surfeit of natural gas in this country. And what was industry going to do about that? Well, I sort of catched this from Zoe Schlanger, who wrote an article last month saying hydrogen is just another hole for natural gas to fill. So, and this is one way of looking at hydrogen, it's not the only way. But, you know, the fracking boom really triggered the reinvigoration of the plastics industry. And then the next thing that happened was these LNG exports. Now, we were able to stop that LNG plant down in Coos Bay, but there have been a bunch of new LNG export plants built on the Gulf Coast still. So that's another place you can send your liquefied natural gas, or I think we should start calling it liquefied methane gas. I don't want to put that natural in there anymore. And again, some people think that a lot of the hydrogen hype is just another place to put our natural gas. And as we know, natural gas is mostly a bridge to more natural gas. Now, on the other hand, and Ms. Schlanger emphasizes this in her article, hydrogen is a pretty cool form of energy if it can be made efficiently, because it can be burned with no carbon emissions. You can use it in a fuel cell, and it could be a climate solution, particularly for the hardest to abate sectors of energy use, things like steel making and maritime shipping. But I would say we still really don't know exactly what role it's going to play in our decarbonized future. Okay, we're gonna get to the nitty-gritty here. How is hydrogen made? There's sort of two basic categories. 95 to 98% of the hydrogen produced in the United States is made by steam methane reforming. And in this, methane is put with steam under pressure, and in the presence of a catalyst, usually nickel, it comes out with carbon monoxide and a whole bunch of hydrogen. This has been done for over 100 years, so this is an old process. And somewhere I've read different things, 95 to 98% of the hydrogen that's used in this country, either to carry energy or as a feedstock for industrial processes, is made by this method. I noticed that the SMR would be how you would, say it quickly, and it's the same as small modular reactors, interestingly enough. Okay. Now, the other way to make hydrogen, and this is somewhat cleaner, is by electrolysis. And this just uses water and electricity. You put electricity through water, splits into hydrogen and oxygen. If the electricity comes from a renewable source, that's what we call green hydrogen. So you've probably heard that term. Okay, now we're going to get into the different colors. Don't get overwhelmed by this. The colors you really need to pay attention are gray, blue, and green. So gray hydrogen is the SMR method, made from methane. And that's the vast, vast, vast majority of the hydrogen that's created in this country now. Now, if you take gray hydrogen and you capture the carbon dioxide with carbon capture and storage, then you get to call it blue hydrogen, which is, I guess, a prettier color. Turquoise hydrogen, I don't know very much about that, but you end up with a solid form of carbon. It starts with methane. You end up with a solid form of carbon. So you wouldn't need carbon capture in that situation. And then there are the different kinds of electrolysis. There's not complete agreement on all of these colors, but green hydrogen, as I mentioned, is the one where you're using renewable electricity. Pink hydrogen would be electricity from nuclear, and yellow hydrogen would be, most people say that that's electricity created from a mixed grid like we have here in Oregon. And then white hydrogen, on this chart it says it's thermochemical, but I've recently seen that in France they discovered a natural source of hydrogen in the ground, just kind of bubbling up, and they were calling that white hydrogen. Okay, so even green hydrogen has problems. So we shouldn't think just because somebody is using green hydrogen that everything's fine. So first of all, it's really inefficient to take electricity, to turn water into hydrogen and then store it or pump it or do whatever you're going to do with it. It's kind of a Rube Goldberg sort of a situation, and it would have been better, if you can, to just use that electricity directly. Another problem is that green hydrogen competes with the direct use of solar and wind electricity that we know we badly need. And then, because hydrogen is explosive, it makes pipes brittle, it really would need new infrastructure. If we were going to pipe our hydrogen anywhere, we're going to transport it in any way. And it doesn't look like we're going to be able to get very much green hydrogen, before 2030, and we really can't wait that long. So green hydrogen probably has some use in the future, but we should use it sparingly only. Now, you might hear the term clean hydrogen thrown around, and just be really cautious, because some people will include in this not only pink and yellow hydrogen, but especially they want to include this gray hydrogen plus carbon capture, which equals blue hydrogen. And as we know, carbon capture has problems. It still is using methane. So don't be fooled by the term clean hydrogen. Really the only halfway decent hydrogen is green hydrogen. Here's some of the problems with that blue hydrogen. The methane leaks have been vastly underestimated. So if you're going to be using that methane to make your hydrogen, you still have all the upstream problems of the leakage from the wells, etc. And there's the Department of Energy uses a congressionally mandated model called GREET. I don't even know what that sounds for. And it requires them to use the 100-year rather than the 20-year global warming potential that we know makes more sense given the situation that we're in. And then that model also uses overly optimistic assumptions about the carbon dioxide capture rate. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that carbon capture currently, when it's being done, is mostly used for enhanced oil recovery. In other words, I envision this as sort of some form of fracking where they push the hydrogen, into the ground where the oil is to get more oil out. So that's not so great. Okay, if I were in the room, I would ask somebody to read this with an Australian accent. I think this is really quite brilliant. You have to ask yourself, who in their right mind would think it's cheaper to dig up a fossil, set it on fire, try to capture the emissions, and bury it, rather than just whacking up some solar panels? So I think that kind of encapsulates the problem with these more complicated ways of trying to use electricity. Now, when you're using hydrogen, this is simplistic. Some hydrogen is used as feedstock for industrial processes, but if you're going to use it for energy, you have two choices really. You can burn it. And just as we know with methane, like you think about your gas stove, you know how your gas stove creates NOx? Well, hydrogen does the same thing. So it's not a substance in the fuel itself, it's the combustion that reacts with the nitrogen in the air. And some people, there's not complete consensus, some people think if you combine hydrogen with methane in the pipes in your home, you'll actually get more NOx. Now the other option, which is I think somewhat cleaner, is to use something as a fuel cell. And I never really quite understood what a fuel cell vehicle was, but essentially it's an electric vehicle. But instead of having a battery, it uses hydrogen to get the chemical energy to produce electricity. And then the only products in that case are the electricity, the water, and some heat. So that's a relatively clean way of doing things. It doesn't mean that that's a better way of doing a vehicle, because there's still a lot of problems with amounts of hydrogen that we're likely to have. And green hydrogen is relatively expensive. It's just going to be better to use the electricity directly rather than with fuel cells. Okay, you've probably heard something about these hydrogen hubs, because there's a whole lot of money being put into this. There is a Northwest hub, which Peter referred to, and he may know more about it than I do, but there are only two of these hubs in the United States that are really focusing on green hydrogen. You can see that a bunch of the hubs are, you know, on the Gulf Coast, and you know what kind of, what they're going to be using to make their hydrogen there. So California is going to make green hydrogen with renewables and biomass. Uh-oh, that doesn't sound like a good idea. And they're going to use it for areas like public transport, heavy-duty trucking, and port operations. And as I understand it, in the Pacific Northwest, we're going to try to harness some of the low emissions energy from our dams and to use the hydrogen for heavy-duty transportation, long-term energy storage, ports, agriculture, and industrial applications. And that's all I know about it, really. There is a lot of interest in trying to be sure that any green hydrogen that's used it's kind of like the offset thing. You want to be sure the rules incorporate appropriate guardrails. So there's something called the 3 pillars approach. They want to be sure that the new hydrogen electrolyzers, that they're new, they're not ones that are already there, that they are connected to the grid, and the added hydrogen that they're producing is being, the electrical demand and the hydrogen production are happening at the same time, basically. And then the third one is that the hydrogen producers have to get their clean electricity from within their region. So even with green hydrogen, we're going to have to watch carefully to be sure that it's being correctly addressed. Okay, this is the one that we know this is bad. There's just no question about it. And that's proposals to use hydrogen in the home in our current natural gas / methane pipes. So this is how our old friend Northwest Natural hopes to comply with the Climate Protection Plan. This is their proposed strategy. This is a slide from one of their presentations. But as you probably are aware, Northwest Natural has actually sued the state about the Climate Protection Plan. They don't like this, and I think it makes sense that they wouldn't like it because it's really not feasible. The orange bar that you see there is what they're proposing to use, what we call renewable natural gas. They call all of these things besides fossil gas, they call them RNG, so don't get confused by that terminology on this slide. But the green one is what they propose, the percentage of their reduction will come from hydrogen. And then you can see that they have this pie in the sky idea about synthetic gas that will come later down the road. Because right now they're basically up here where the would-be emissions, and they need to get down to the CPP emissions cap. And this is what percent of that reduction they think will come from hydrogen. Okay, so here's the top 10 reasons why blending hydrogen into gas pipes is a bad idea. Number 10, hydrogen makes pipes brittle. Therefore, the amount that you can mix into your natural gas is limited to about 20%. But hydrogen is less energy dense than methane, so even at 20%, you only decrease your greenhouse gases by about 7% with hydrogen injection. Hydrogen is a tiny molecule, and it likes to leak even more than methane. And it's very explosive, so leaks from hydrogen could be dangerous. Most hydrogen, as I mentioned before today, is made from methane, so it's not a clean form of hydrogen. And we're unlikely to have enough hydrogen made from renewable electricity. And it's much less efficient than just using the electricity directly. We know that electrification of home heating is what makes sense. Continuing to use methane in our homes perpetuates the use of fossil fuels, much like pellets and coal plants. Adding hydrogen to methane in homes may increase the formation of health-harming NOx. Hydrogen is expensive, will increase our costs, and explosive. There was a UK study that estimated that there'd be 4 times as many explosions if it were used regularly in homes. So, to get back to, if somebody presents to you, oh, we've got this great idea, we've got this hydrogen project we think is the cat's meow, the first question is, what is the alternative? Could we just be using the electricity directly? And then the second question is, does this have anything to do with methane? So is the hydrogen coming from methane, or are you injecting the hydrogen into methane pipes? Anytime hydrogen and methane are sort of in the same sentence, probably not a good idea. And then just like with any kind of biofuel project that we're trying to evaluate, we always have to think about what are the local and the justice issues? Who lives around there? What kind of pollution is it going to cause? All of those same things that we do with traditional fossil fuels. All right, I think that's it. And I don't know if we're going to do action items separately or not, but I'll put in a plug now for a week from today. Wear red. You get to wear red. Come to Multnomah County, which is 501 Southeast Hawthorne. I think the testimony will be starting around 9:30. You don't have to testify, but we want to fill the room. Talking about clean air standards, and that is a way to decrease the amount of methane that's used. And that is it for my presentation.
Thank you, Natalie. And our next panelist is me, and I'm going to talk about this thing that's called renewable diesel. Get our slides up here. Okay, yeah, I'm the host of Locus Books. So, we all remember Zenith Energy. You all seem to be familiar with it. A little over a year ago, after we thought we'd stopped it, it turned out that Dan Ryan, and we also discovered later, Carmen Rubio, were in a backroom deal with Zenith Energy to get them another land use compatibility statement. We need slides, Janine. Oh, I'm doing them. Okay, just a second here. This is going to be, I think I'd rather you do them. Okay, good. Okay. So let's get the first slides up here. To remind us of Zenith, yes. So we thought we had a victory, and then we discovered that Zenith was granted a land use compatibility statement because it was going to switch in 5 years from producing or from transporting fossil fuels to transporting renewable diesel. So a lot of us asked, what is renewable diesel? So let's keep flipping through this. Okay, this is all our memory of Zenith. Going through that. So in order to find out what renewable diesel was, there was a bunch of us who started a study group and we were trying to find things out. And then Dan Sears mentioned to me that in California, see, renewable diesel was kind of new to us, but in California, they've been fighting it for years. So he connected me up with Ben Eichenberg, who is one of the staff attorneys for the San Francisco Bay Keeper. And they, Ben invited me down and he was going to hook me up with a bunch of activists and take me on a boat ride in the bay so I could see all of the refineries along San Pablo Bay that are converting from fossil fuel to renewable diesel. And so we started out in Martinez and went under the Martinez Bridge. And we're heading into the Martinez Straits.
This is a salmon power spot for me, man. This is a serious salmon spot. Well, because every single salmon either returning or leaving from the Sacramento or San Joaquin has to go right here. 40 million acres. Every single one.
And now we're going to see the refineries. We think we have a lot of mess on the Willamette River. You should boat around on the San Francisco Bay. And this is the Rodeo refinery that's going to be converting to renewable diesel unless it's stopped by a current appeal of its environmental review. And then speaking of hydrogen, we're going to come up to the Coker. And there, in the, so coming up now, is where the hydrogen is mixed with the soybean oil to produce, they have to crack it. So they use a lot of hydrogen. And that's it, the black thing right there is the hydrogen facility.
You got it. Pretty good news of that plastic. And there's another hydrogen plant.
So what is renewable diesel? And actually, renewable diesel is chemically the same thing as fossil diesel, but it's processed by using a variety of feedstocks that are all basically food oils, and they are cracked, as is petroleum, and we saw the cracking facility there. And the process is called hydrotreated esters and fatty acids. And the esters and fatty acids are vegetable oils, and they need to be broken apart or cracked. And that's part of the process. One of the interesting things about renewable diesel, and we hear when we talk to Carmen Rubio's office in Portland, that it's far less carbon intensive than fossil fuel, and that it'll be really great and it's renewable and it's less polluting and all this stuff. But it turns out that it takes a lot more energy to crack it's basically the soybean oil, to crack the food oils, seed oils, than it is to crack fossil fuel or petroleum. So that in itself it takes more energy to make, it creates a lot more heat, it uses a lot more hydrogen, and Melanie just told you how great hydrogen is, and this is all gray hydrogen that they're using in these refineries. And they've been using the hydrogen in the refineries for years, I mean, this is not a new process. And then the other thing that's interesting is because it's has a lower energy level than petroleum, you have to use more of the renewable diesel in your truck. So it comes out that the advantages in terms of energy usage, it's very minimal. In fact, and it has a lot more problems, which we'll get into.
Plus you have to use petroleum just to grow the soy.
Yeah, well, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. So what's happening in the Bay Area is that two refineries, the Marathon refinery in Martinez and the Rodeo Phillips 66 refinery, have both decided to convert to producing renewable diesel. The Marathon refinery opened, and it's been open for about a year, and so people already know the impacts of it. And it's causing more pollution than the petroleum refinery caused, and it's noisier, and there's more heat, and there's a lot of issues. Interesting with the Phillips 66 refinery, it reminds me a lot, actually, what went on with fighting the methanol refinery in Cowlitz County. That Cowlitz County was the entity that was doing the environmental impact statement. It was done for them. And that there's an awful lot that was left out, like the life cycle analysis of methane, small things like that. Well, it turns out that Contra Costa County was responsible for the environmental impact review for the Rodeo refinery, and they left out a lot of things, like, as you mentioned, the amount of fossil fuel it takes to grow the plants that are going to be eventually used. So they were sued by a bunch of different entities, including the NRDC, and they lost on most of their appeals, but they did win on the issue of odor. And it turned out that in the EIR, they had just sort of not, they thought they'd deal with odor later. But the people who live around the refinery are very concerned about odor. And one of them, who was on the boat with me, said, she asked one of the people, she asked an authority, well, is it going to smell like Willie Nelson's socks? And he said, no, it's going to smell like a rendering plant. So that gets us into one of the big issues about renewable diesel. And these are the questions, by the way, we've talked to the city, me being, and Kathy Stafford's right there, she was involved with this, and a number of others of us. We talked to the city about the questions that we have, and these are questions that the city doesn't want to answer, or ask, let alone get answered. And this is the same thing that's been going on in the Bay Area, and they're getting answers because they're actually living next to this one refinery that's actually functioning. But one of the big questions is, what is the feedstock going to be? They like to say it's going to be use French fry oil, from McDonald's. They're going to go around and collect all the French fry oil, and they're going to turn it into renewable diesel, and therefore it's a waste product, and it's renewable and it's green. The reality of it is, of course, there's not enough French fry oil in the world to support what we need, and that what exists already is already being used by small producers, not producers on the level of Phillips 66 and Marathon. So what's probably going to be used it'll be like things like a rendered animal fat and stuff like that, which would not be very nice stuff to have around. But it's mostly going to be crops that are grown specifically for fuel. And we've already experienced this some with ethanol, and all the ethanol plants in the Midwest in particular, which, by the way, there was a pipeline that was proposed to get back to hydrogen. Oh, this is for carbon capture and storage. They proposed a pipeline that was going to go from Iowa up to North Dakota, carrying the methane, the carbon dioxide that was going to be captured from the ethanol facilities. And the pipeline was stopped, by the way. Of course, that pipeline, interestingly, was going to go, and they were going to deposit it in these deep deposits right near where the fracking fields are in North Dakota. So you know it's really going to be used for these depleted oil wells. So that's one problem, that once you start using food crops for fuel, a whole lot of other questions need to be answered, like, well, what are the large-scale impacts of that? What does it mean when you replace food that's grown for people and animals even, and start putting it in our cars? Well, we're going to have to grow the food somewhere else for the people, or use different sources of oil. So soybean oil, which is already becoming more expensive because it's being used for producing renewable diesel and other things like that, that one of the possibilities, and this is, I learned this word from one of the people I interviewed in California, fungible, which means that you can take, like, an oil, instead of using soybean oil, because you can't get any more, well, let's use palm oil. And so one of the fears is this is really going to increase the use of palm oil. And of course, I don't need to go in this audience about what palm oil does. And interestingly, there's a proposal for renewable diesel refinery in Port Westford, which is right near Platskadai, just about 60 miles from here. Are people familiar with that one? And I think actually it's going to go away, but it's been there looming over the community for about 5 years. And one of their questions is, like what they're going to be using. And it looks like, again, they would be using soybean oil. Zenith, on the other hand, I heard a rumor from Nick Caleb, not so much a rumor, he saw the papers, that the plans for what they're going to be shipping through Zenith would be palm oil, palm oil-based renewable diesel that's produced in Singapore. So just think about the carbon footprint for that. So that's one problem, one small problem. Another one is what happens if the feedstocks spill? If the finished product spills, we're pretty familiar with cleaning up oil spills. Not that we're good at it, but at least we have some experience with it. If the feedstock spills, we don't know anything about it. And in fact, there was a spill about 10 years ago, or 5 or 10 years ago in the Bay, in San Francisco Bay, and there was this goo that was like all over the beaches, and it was killing the marine life, and it was really awful, and Baykeeper went to the authorities, like the Army Corps of Engineers and the other people who would do things like cleanup, and they say, it's not petroleum, it's not our business. It turns out it was soybean oil. And and it was a small amount. One of the people that I talked to in California was describing how the only studies that they've done on the impacts of spilling amounts of seed oil into waterways is they've studied small amounts. But to think about millions, tens, 20s, hundreds of millions of gallons of fish oil or soybean oil or any of these other oils in the Columbia River or in the San Francisco Bay, it's overwhelming. And it made me think about, I give my cats fish oil in the morning, and I started thinking about how gooey the little bit is on the bottom of their bowls is after when I clean the bowls. And to think, multiplying that by a few billion, it would give you a sense of what we're up to. So that's another example of like the unknowns that we have to be dealing with. There's another problem too when they calculate, 3 minutes? When they calculate how much, what the carbon intensity of this is, which is a way of saying that it's not going to be that bad of an emitter, that they're not figuring, they have a model that doesn't include a whole lot of things that need to be modeled. And so that's another thing that we need to be talking about, and again, looking at the life cycle of this entire, of the materials that are going to be used. And let's see, then of course there's a concern about explosions, because biodiesel, renewable diesel trains, if they derail, are going to explode just the same as fossil fuel. So we have the same problems with Zenith or we have anywhere else. And then the last problem is that, like Marathon in Martinez was going to shut down. It did shut down because there's not enough oil. The world does not need the amount of oil that they're producing in California. And so they shut down, but unfortunately they have to clean up if they shut down. And so the better alternative for them was to start producing renewable diesel instead. And there's this thing in California, the low carbon fuel standards, which is actually paying them credits to produce renewable diesel because it's considered a renewable green fuel. So another thing we have to do is change the conversation about renewable. As we talk about renewable with air quotes, and we need a different word for it. So the final conclusion about all this is that refinery owners want to delay closure of their facilities in order to put off having to spend money on the cleanup. So instead, they're trying to protect their assets by getting subsidies for switching to refining plant oils instead. And so the only ones who are going to really benefit from the renewable diesel boom will be the current oil refining producers. And that's what I have to say. So now we're going to Q&A in a minute, but first we have a couple action items that we want to mention, and if Bonnie's around, you might help me with this. No, we don't want to watch that. So tomorrow there's going to be a meeting of a group that's called the Emerging Coalition, and it meets, sometimes it meets in person at this wonderful space we have in Lloyd Center on the 2nd floor. But tomorrow it's going to be meeting virtually. And so if you're interested in going to the meeting, which is, it's a coalition of coalitions. And it's a group of people from a lot of different groups around the city and the region who are dealing with both Zenith in short and the CEI hub at large. And we are coming up with different ways and different actions and ways of trying to communicate with our elected officials. So it's a really good group of people, and I highly recommend going to the meeting. So if you're interested, there's a sign-up sheet, and you can sign your name, give your email address, and Bonnie will email you the link to the Zoom meeting tomorrow. So that's one action.
Can you say something about Diane Dick?
Oh, yes, and this is a very exciting thing. Diane Dick, who is up in Cowlitz County, in Longview, who has been fighting, goes all the way back to the coal terminals. I mean, she's been fighting every fossil fuel project that's happened in Cowlitz County for the last 15 years, and she knows everything. Anyway, she's going to be at the meeting talking about Drax tomorrow. So I highly recommend that, because she's really fascinating.
Should be at the first part of the meeting. So if you can't stay for the whole thing, you can get some lowdown on Drax and what we can do about it.
Yeah. And then for more things about Drax, there's going to be a screening of the film. I think that Peter mentioned this. Burn, which is going to be a benefit put on by 350 PDX at Clinton Street Theater on January 8th. And that's highly recommended. And I'm actually going to have Brenna Bell from, well, she's now with 350, right? And she's going to be on Locus Focus talking about Drax and talking about the movie on January 8th. So it's a day to look forward to. And then finally, my new project is about false climate solutions. And I'm doing a radio documentary, which I'm going to turn into a film. It'll be like Once a Braided River. I'm raising money. So if you want to help support it, I have a handout there, and there's a website where you can go and donate. So thanks very much, and what? Oh, okay. So okay, sign in tonight so you can stay in the loop. Thank Multnomah County Commissioners for sending the letter to DEQ urging the denial of the air quality permit. Yes. So let's all thank them whole lot. And there's a great article in Street Roots and another article in the Oregonian. I didn't think it was that great. I read it last night. But it's been really great that there's been a lot of publicity about that. And enoil and call Governor Kotek and her climate advisor, Karen Powers, her climate advisor. That's a good sign. My former rep. To urge the state to deny the upcoming air quality discharge permit for Zenith Energy. And there's Karen Powers' email, karen.power@oregon.gov, or call 503-378-4582. Any other action items? I think that's it. So I think we can now do a Q&A. So we bring back our next Rumble. Okay. Our next Rumble is going to be in January. We know where it is. It's going to be at Multnomah Friends Meeting House on Southeast Stark, and we know who's going to be there. I'm not sure if we want to mention that now, but we don't know when it's going to be. So it'll be either January 18th, January 25th, or January 31st. So keep all those days. And we hope to see you then. So I guess we want to get our panelists back.
And can you do the previous slide again so we can take a
Oh,
look?
okay, right here, okay. Karen Power, or, good. Everybody have the phone number and the email address?
No.
No, okay.
Sign up, we'll share it.
Will this go on Instagram? Will it go on Instagram?
What's that?
Will it go on social media?
What?
That information?
I don't know about that. Will be growing on social media, maybe? We're going to be posting the video on YouTube. Okay, so here's our panel. So we were going to think about some questions beforehand, which we never thought of. But anyway, is there somebody there? Okay, question?
I have a question for Barbara, not Barbara Bernstein.
Barbara, hi.
Barbara, yeah, thank you. So I may be getting this all wrong, but my understanding with some of the carbon offset, cut down forest crap, is like, you get credits if you, instead of cutting down your forest in 30 years, you wait until 100 years. I don't know, that was the thing that I read. I don't know if that's like still a true thing, if that's like part of what they're actually talking about. And if so, it seems to me that even in the fantasy land where they actually do wait 100 years, you know, and you haven't gone bankruptcy and skip down or whatever, it's still just like, in the best case scenario, you would only be gaining some benefit 30 years from now, which is way past when we need to do stuff. Am I getting that right, or are they not even doing that calculation? Is that like an old bad thing or?
Do you want to speak to that, Barbara? Did you hear the question?
No, Barbara, you're gonna have to repeat the question.
Okay, short of it is, The question was that the questioner asked about that people are getting carbon offsets for delaying logging their forests from 30 years to 100 years. And she was wondering if, what's the rest of it?
Even if in Fantasyland they really did wait 100 years, would that, I mean, best case scenario.
Okay, so is there any benefit for that if they were to wait 70 years longer to log their forests?
Sorry, my understanding is that if you delay harvesting for a short amount, 5, 10, 15 years, depending upon the type of forest, then yes, you can get more carbon on the landscape while you continue harvesting. So my understanding is that 70 years, it's conservation. So then you want to be looking at, you know, are you, yeah, I mean, you're conserving forests.
Do you want to try? Yeah.
I could add a little bit to that. I mean, oftentimes, so this is part of it, like the Hula in the Forest conference, this is what some of the timber folks there were saying was, well, we would do offsets and we would say, well, we won't log our forests as short rotations, we'll extend the rotations, which in some sense does just kind of push it out. I mean, the land will accumulate more carbon over that time, but a lot of carbon is released when you log a forest, because it's most of the carbon in a forest, like the majority of it is not in above ground tree mass. It's underground in roots in the soil, and a lot of that is released when, you know, most logging now happens with heavy machinery that tears up the soil and releases a lot of that carbon. So it is just kind of like delaying the emissions to a certain extent. As far as conservation benefits, I think if we're talking about private timberlands, they're still replanting monoculture Doug fir around here at least. I can't speak to what's going on in other parts of the world. And then they're also applying aerial herbicides. So, I mean, there's not, it feels a little grotesque to talk about like tree plantations being logged every 100 years or every 70 years instead of every 40 years as conservation. I think the conservation benefit to that is like pretty minimal. But we see this often paired, the industry saying, wood products are a form of carbon sequestration. You know, we'll cut down the trees, but the carbon in the trees in the forest will then be in your furniture or the walls of your house. And 85% of carbon in a forest is released when it is logged. Only 15% of the carbon actually ends up stored in those wood products because there's so much waste throughout the supply chain. So much of the tree ends up all the limbs and the foliage, the roots, sawdust, and then you account for the transportation throughout the supply chain. That's a pretty minimal benefit as far as the actual storage there. The idea that wood products can store significant amounts of carbon and that it feels like a similar thing to the biomass, kind of that like accounting errors that Peter was talking about earlier, and that there's some, kind of double counting in that regard. So I think it depends. I've heard them talk about extending rotations as a carbon offset for forests in the Northwest. I believe, and I'm sure Barbara could speak to this better, that's not necessarily how they're doing it around the world, that there are different schemes, that in some places it's not like we're still going to log definitely this forest that we're selling as an offset, we're just going to do it a little bit later. I think some projects it is, we're not going to log at all. And even then there's questions about that, well, were you really going to log? Because in order for it to be sold as an offset, it has to be something that was going to happen otherwise. And so there's an incentive for these landowners to say, we're going to log if you don't buy this offset. Really, definitely going to cut. Oh, okay, we won't cut the trees down because you bought an offset. And then the next year, we're going to log unless you buy these offsets. There's that kind of like perverse incentive. And so especially anyone that's talking about doing conservation, is that going to be happening anyways? Were you actually going to cut the trees?
Another question? Anybody else have a question?
Actually, if you could come up here, and then our Zoom guests can also hear.
Any other questions? I guess if there's no more questions, Okay, I guess we're done. It's great to have you here from California and Washington.